Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into a pretty controversial period in history.
Hmm.
Operation Condor. It happened down in Latin America during the 70s and 80s. And we're going to be looking at it through the lens of this book called The Wild Frontier, 200 Years of Anglo-Saxon Fanaticism in Latin America. It's by Jorge Majfud.
Okay.
He's a Uruguayan-American author. And
Interesting.
yeah, and he's pretty critical, I would say, of U.S. involvement in the region. So we're going to be focusing on a few key things that he brings up. One is this whole idea of Operation Mockingbird and how the press was used. And then, of course, the actual impact of Operation Condor itself, places like Chile and Argentina, Uruguay. And then also the U.S. role in kind of propping up these different dictatorships across Latin America. It's going to get pretty intense. We're going to be talking about assassinations, political intrigue, all that fun stuff. So buckle up.
Yeah, sounds like a really dark chapter to unpack. For folks maybe who aren't as familiar with this period, it's important to remember the context, right? The Cold War was raging.
Right.
And the U.S. was, well, very, very anti-communist. That fear really drove a lot of their foreign policy, especially when it came to Latin America. And Operation Condor, in a nutshell, it was this coordinated effort, right, by these right-wing dictatorships in South America to eliminate their political opponents.
Yeah.
And there were these alleged ties to the U.S. It's a really dark stain. I mean, we're talking about something like 50,000 victims across multiple continents.
Yeah, 50,000. It's just mind-blowing. And one of the things that Majfud brings up that I found just incredibly disturbing is this whole Operation Mockingbird thing.
Oh, right.
He claims that the CIA was using journalists, writers, even academics, like to spread propaganda
Yeah.
all over the world. It sounds like something out of a movie, but he actually, he even points to Howard Hunt.
Oh, wow.
The Watergate guy, who actually admitted to doing this.
Right.
To manipulating the media.
Which is huge, right? I mean, for Hunt to come out and admit that, it basically confirms that, the CIA was actively working to control the narrative, using media outlets, to push their own agenda. And what Majfud argues is that this wasn't just limited to, the U.S. itself.
Right.
He connects it to Latin America with this thing called Operación Sinsonte.
Operation Sinsonte.
Yeah. And this specifically targeted the media narratives surrounding events like the Chilean coup against Allende, for example.
It makes you wonder how much of what we read or see is actually, the full story.
Right. Like, how do we even know what's real anymore? Especially when you think about how information spreads today, it's even more complex.
Right. But how did this media manipulation, how did it actually play into Operation Condor itself? What was the connection there?
Well, you have to think about it. Controlling the narrative is, essential in any conflict. If you can control what people hear and see and read about something, then you can control how they perceive it.
Right.
You can even justify really brutal actions.
Wow.
And especially when you're dealing with something as charged as communism was during the Cold War. It was like this ultimate boogeyman.
So these regimes could basically paint their opponents as dangerous communists and get people to support their crackdown.
Exactly, yeah. It creates this environment of fear and paranoia,
Right.
which makes it way easier to justify all kinds of terrible things in the name of, national security or whatever. And that's where the real horror of Operation Condor starts to unfold. I mean, Majfud doesn't pull any punches when he describes the impact. He talks about it as a reign of terror that was happening across South America. Chile, Argentina, Bolivia, Uruguay. It was brutal. You have forced disappearances, torture, assassinations. Anyone who spoke out against the regimes, they were silenced.
And it wasn't just theoretical, right? These were real people.
Oh, absolutely. These are real people with families and lives and dreams who were just brutally silenced.
One of the most shocking examples, I think, that Majfud highlights is the assassination of Orlando Letelier.
Yeah.
Who was a former Chilean ambassador. And get this, he was killed by a car bomb. Right here in Washington, D.C.
I know, right? It's crazy. A political assassination right in the U.S. Capitol.
It's wild.
It just shows how far the reach of Operation Condor extended.
Letelier was a very outspoken critic of the Pinochet dictatorship. And the investigation into his assassination revealed these links to Chilean secret police, Cuban exiles operating within the U.S. It was a huge deal.
Yeah. I mean, it's just chilling to think about. But was the U.S. really involved in all of this, directly involved?
That's the big question that Majfud is raising, right?
Yeah.
He lays out this evidence, suggesting that the U.S., driven by their anti-communist stance, They didn't just know about this stuff happening. They actively supported it.
He cites these declassified documents, diplomatic cables that, allegedly show that U.S. officials, they knew about the human rights abuses that were going on,
Right.
but they kept providing aid and support to these regimes anyway.
It's hard to believe. I mean, a country that, is supposed to stand for democracy and human rights, how could they be complicit in these kinds of things?
Well, like I said before, you have to remember the context of the Cold War.
Yeah.
It was this intense ideological struggle.
Yeah.
And for the U.S., the spread of communism, it was like an existential threat.
Right.
And Majfud argues that this fear, it led them to make some very questionable decisions.
So they felt like the ends justified the means.
Exactly. That was their justification. But Majfud pushes back on that. He argues that these actions, they had devastating, long-lasting consequences for the people of Latin America, created this legacy of fear and instability and resentment that continues to this day. He tells this really heartbreaking story of a woman named Nicasia Rodriguez in Argentina. She was a mother who resisted a military raid and ended up being killed, leaving her 3 children to face the horrors of the junta.
Oh, wow.
And her story, it's just one of many, right? But it highlights the human cost of this whole ideology.
Yeah, wow. So we've got media manipulation, state-sponsored terrorism, and this alleged U.S. complicity. What else? What else is there?
Well, Majfud takes us even deeper. He reveals this connection that seems almost too crazy to be true. He talks about the involvement of Nazi war criminals in Operation Condor.
Wait, what? Nazis? In South America? How's that even possible?
I know, right? It sounds unbelievable. But this is where things get really wild. So we left off with this crazy connection to Nazis. Majfud really dives into the specifics in Bolivia. And he focuses on this guy, Klaus Barbie. He was known as the Butcher of Lyon, responsible for all these atrocities during World War II. And get this, he ended up finding refuge in Bolivia. He was actually employed by the Bolivian dictatorship, like as an advisor.
It's hard to wrap my head around that. I mean, a Nazi war criminal advising a South American dictatorship? It just seems so surreal.
It is. It's wild. And Majfud even goes as far as saying that Barbie was at one point on the CIA payroll.
Hey, what? Really?
Yeah, it's pretty shocking. Apparently his expertise in interrogation, counterinsurgency, stuff he learned as a Gestapo officer,
Right.
it was valuable to the U.S. in their fight against communism.
That's a lot to process. It just seems like such a complete moral compromise.
It really does. And it brings up these really uncomfortable questions about what the U.S. was willing to do during the Cold War. Like how far were they willing to go?
Right. It's disturbing. But I know that Majfud doesn't just focus on South America. He also talks about U.S. intervention in Central America.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, he goes into detail about countries like Guatemala, El Salvador, and he argues that the U.S. was deeply involved there too, often supporting, these really brutal authoritarian regimes and undermining any democratically elected governments that they saw as too friendly towards communism.
Yeah, he specifically mentions the CIA-backed coup in Guatemala in 1954, the one that overthrew Jacobo Arbenz, who was the democratically elected president.
Yeah, that's a prime example of this pattern that Majfud highlights. The U.S., intervening in these Latin American countries to basically prevent the spread of communism. And they didn't seem to care if it meant supporting dictators or even toppling democratically elected leaders.
Yeah, and what about El Salvador? I know he talks about that too, the brutal civil war that was raging there during the 80s.
Oh, yeah. El Salvador is another key example. The U.S. was heavily involved there, backing the Salvadoran government in their fight against these leftist guerrilla groups.
Right.
They poured tons of money into military aid, training for the Salvadoran military, which, was notorious for committing human rights abuses.
Yeah, it's a really tragic situation. It seems like, this whole Cold War, it wasn't just some abstract ideological battle happening in, some far-off place. It had a real impact on the lives of so many people.
Exactly. And Majfud's work really drives that point home. He makes it clear that these interventions had a devastating human cost. And he forces us to confront this uncomfortable truth that the U.S., a country that claims to champion freedom and democracy, was often contributing to the very suffering that they claim to be trying to prevent. It's a real paradox.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in. And I guess the big question is, like, where do we go from here? What can we even learn from all of this?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, what lessons can we take away from Operation Condor, from the U.S. involvement in Latin America,
Yeah.
to make sure that nothing like this ever happens again? It's something that we have to really grapple with, and that's what we're going to be exploring in the final part of our deep dive.
So we've really gone deep into this dark period
Mm.
with Operation Condor. And it's clear that the Cold War had a really devastating impact on Latin America. I mean, even today you can still see the scars. But, how do we even begin to move forward from something like this? What are the lessons that we can take away?
Well, I think one of the most important things that Majfud's book really highlights is just how easy it is for information to be manipulated.
Right.
He talks about Operation Mockingbird, how it was used to influence what people were reading and hearing in the media. It's a reminder that we can't just take everything at face value.
It's so easy to just accept what you see on the news or read in an article, especially if it seems like it's coming from, a credible source.
Right, exactly. But Moshfield's work shows us that even those sources, well-respected journalists, media outlets, they can be influenced by these powerful forces that have their own agenda.
It's kind of scary when you think about it.
It is, it is. And that's why he emphasizes this idea of being an active consumer of information.
Right.
Questioning what you're seeing, hearing, reading, seeking out different perspectives.
Don't just take things at face value.
Exactly. There's always more to the story.
It's like, peeling back the layers of onion.
Yeah, yeah. It's about constantly digging deeper, trying to find the truth.
But it's not just about, being skeptical of the media. Mashwood also pushes us to confront some uncomfortable truths about, our own history.
Hmm.
Specifically, the role that the U.S. played in supporting these really oppressive regimes in Latin America.
Yeah, that's a really crucial point. He's saying that if we want to actually learn from the past and prevent these kinds of atrocities from happening again, we have to be willing to face those uncomfortable truths. We have to acknowledge that, even powerful nations like the U.S., they can make mistakes. They can make really bad decisions.
Yeah, and understand that those decisions, those actions, they have consequences.
Exactly. They have real-world consequences, and often those consequences are felt most acutely by the people who are least able to protect themselves.
So it's about holding those in power accountable, even if it means,
Yeah.
challenging the stories that make us look good.
Yeah.
Right? The narratives that paint, our own nation in a favorable light.
Right. It's about being honest with ourselves about our history, even when it's difficult. But, I think the question that comes up for a lot of people is accountability even possible? I mean, when we're talking about events that happened decades ago, is there any way to actually achieve justice for the victims of Operation Condor?
That's a good question. I mean, it seems like almost impossible sometimes.
It is a complex issue, and there's no easy answer. The pursuit of justice for the victims of Operation Condor, it's an ongoing process. Many of these countries are still grappling with the legacy of what happened, trying to uncover the truth, bring the perpetrators to justice, provide some kind of closure for the families of those who were disappeared or tortured or killed.
It's like even after all these years, the wounds are still so raw.
They are, and I think it reminds us that the process of healing, of seeking justice, it takes time. It takes a sustained effort and a commitment to keep pushing for the truth, even when it's difficult.
But what about us? Like, what can we do as individuals? What are the lessons that we can take from Operation Condor and apply to, our lives today?
Well, one of the things that Majfud's work really emphasizes is that we can't just be passive observers of history.
Yeah.
We have a responsibility to be informed citizens, engaged citizens, to speak out against injustice wherever we see it.
Yeah.
Whether it's supporting organizations that are fighting for human rights and accountability, or just being more mindful of the information that we consume and share, we all have a role to play in building a more just world.
It's about being aware, being engaged, and, not being afraid to stand up for what's right.
Exactly. And remembering that the fight for human rights and democracy, it's not a one-time thing. It's an ongoing struggle that requires constant vigilance. We can't just assume that things like Operation Condor could never happen again.
Right.
We have to learn from the past, be aware of the present, and work to create a better future.
Yeah, it's a powerful reminder. Operation Condor, it shows us what can happen when power goes unchecked, when ideology takes over, when national interests are put above, basic human rights.
It's a cautionary tale. And I think the biggest takeaway is that we have to be vigilant. We have to protect our own democracies, hold our leaders accountable.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into Operation Condor and the U.S. role in Latin America. It's been a tough one, but it's an important story.
It is.
And I hope that everyone listening has learned something from it.
Yeah.
Stay curious, keep questioning, and never stop fighting for a more just and equitable world.